The entrance hall of Harrowfield Park smelled of pine boughs and beeswax, and the particular cold that seeps through stone walls, no matter how many fires are laid against it. Candles in the wall sconces threw warm light across the faces of perhaps 30 early arrivals, and their voices rose and fell in the cheerful, merciless murmur of a crowd that has already made its assessments and is now merely confirming them. Andrew Fraser stood at the edge of the hall's marble floor, her mantle still on her shoulders, her gloves the color of old cream against the darker fabric, and she understood within her first 30 seconds inside Harrowfield that Reverend Thomas Gale had arrived before her. She could not see him yet. She did not need to. She could trace his passage through the room by the quality of the glances that found her, settled, and slid away. A woman in gray-blue, near the doorway, leaned toward her companion and said something behind her fan, and her companion's eyes moved to Andrew and then moved on with the particular incuriousness of someone who has just been told there is nothing worth looking at. Andrew had spent 6 years learning to recognize that expression. She removed her mantle and handed it to a footman and smoothed the front of her gown, which was plain white muslin trimmed with a narrow edge of silver ribbon, 3 seasons old if it was a day. And she walked into the room as though she belonged there, because she had learned that as well. What she did not see, because she was watching Gale's invisible wake and not the broad staircase to her left, was the Duke of Harrowfield, pausing at the upper landing. She did not see him still. She did not see the way his eyes found her, and did not move on. She had first understood the cost of her silence on a November morning 6 years ago, seated across a writing table from Reverend Gale in his study in Hertfordshire, while outside the window 3 children from the parish school were chasing a dog through the garden. She had been the governess for his household's 2 daughters for 11 months at that point, and she had found the discrepancy 3 weeks before buried in the household accounts that the housekeeper had asked her to help organize while the housekeeper's eyes were failing. A column of expenditures for the parish poor relief fund, £40 distributed across 7 entries, and not one of those £40 traceable to any recorded recipient. She had looked at it for a long time. She had looked at the children through the window. She had thought about the parish school which Gale ran, and the 12 children in it who had nowhere else to go, and she had closed the ledger and said nothing. Gale had dismissed her the following week with a letter of reference so precisely, carefully, damaging that every household in 3 counties had read it and set it aside. She had not regretted her silence. She had regretted, with a precision that increased rather than faded, being made to pay for it, as though she had done something wrong. She had arrived at Harrowfield 4 days prior, as lady's companion to her distant cousin, Mrs. Frederica Colston, who was a pleasant, anxious woman of 53, with a genuine fondness for Andrew, and a social position just secure enough to bring Andrew inside the door. Frederica had been apologetic about the accommodations and overly enthusiastic about the guest list, and Andrew had been grateful for both qualities without being able to tell her so. The role of companion suited neither her training nor her temperament, but it was a position, and it was warm, and Gale was not supposed to be among the invited. She found him near the fireplace at the drawing-room end of the hall, in conversation with a broad-shouldered man she did not recognize, and the moment he saw her, his expression underwent one of its characteristic small revisions, the sort a man makes when he has decided to smile at a thing he is also afraid of. She nodded to him once with the exact degree of courtesy the situation required, and moved toward the far end of the room where Frederica had found a chair. Lady Cecily Ashford, Dowager Duchess of Harrowfield, entered through the connecting door from the drawing-room at 7:15, and the room rearranged itself around her, the way a room does around a person who has spent 60 years expecting it to. She was a handsome woman, 70 years old, at least, with white hair, dressed in the current mode, and a triple strand of garnets at her throat that caught the candlelight with every slight movement of her head. At her left was a young woman in deep rose silk, whom Andrew did not know, a Miss Philippa Vance, if the whisper that reached her from 2 chairs away was to be trusted. Philippa Vance was the kind of beautiful that requires a particular social context to be fully appreciated, the kind that looks best in proximity to wealth and approval, which she currently had in abundance. She moved with the confidence of a woman who has been told by everyone whose opinion she values that she is exactly where she ought to be. Cecily's eyes found Andrew across the room, within 4 minutes of her entrance. The assessment was brief and complete, and what it concluded was visible in the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth before she turned to speak to the man on her right. Gale reached Andrew shortly after 8 o'clock, at a moment when Frederica had gone to speak with an old friend and Andrew was briefly alone beside the window embrasure. He moved with the ease of a man on familiar social ground, and he greeted her as though they shared a pleasant history, rather than the specific history they actually shared. "Miss Fraser," he said. "What a surprise to find you at Harrowfield, is it?" she said. He tilted his head at a small angle. "You look well. Better than I might have expected, given your circumstances." He paused to let that land. "I hope we understand each other as well as we always have." She kept her eyes on the room. "I understand you perfectly, Reverend Gale." He said nothing further. He did not need to. The understanding between them was 6 years old, and had not required fresh language in some time. He moved away, and she stood at the window and watched snow beginning to fall against the dark glass, very fine and straight in the still air, and she breathed carefully until her hands stopped wanting to shake. She did not sleep well that first night, nor the second. On the morning of the 3rd day before the ball, she went to the library at an early hour because she had found in her 4 days at Harrowfield that it was the one room where no one came before 9, and she needed one room in this house where she could think without managing her expression. The library occupied the east wing's ground floor, 2 long walls of shelved volumes, a writing table near the window, a pair of armchairs before a fire that a housemaid had laid at 6. The light came in gray and clean from the park outside. Andrew had brought her own book, a volume of natural history she had carried in her trunk for 3 years, and she sat in the nearer armchair and did not open it. She heard him before she saw him, the deliberate sound of a man's boot on the library threshold, a sound that expected the room to be empty. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Harrowfield, was not a tall man, but he occupied space the way certain objects do: a stone in a garden, a closed door, a piece of well-made furniture in a room, otherwise full of fashionable things. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that was going gray at the temples, and a face that had been formed for expression and had, somewhere in the intervening years, been trained against it. His jaw was even, his eyes a dark gray that in the early light looked very nearly the color of the snow outside the window, and he stopped in the library doorway and looked at her with an attention so level and so long that she felt the armchair beneath her as a specific, physical object for the first time since she had sat down. "Miss Fraser," he said, "Your Grace." She moved to stand. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. It was the sort of sentence a man says when he means something by it other than the literal instruction, and she could not determine what that other meaning was. She sat. He crossed to the writing table and set down the papers he had carried, and did not immediately begin working on them. And after a moment he said, without turning from the table, "You have been in this library before this morning." It was not a question. She said, "I have. I hope I have not presumed." "No." He paused. "Come again, if you require it." He worked at the table for perhaps 20 minutes while she sat in the armchair and tried to read her book, and she was not aware of the specific moment she stopped trying and simply sat in the gray morning light, listening to the quiet scratch of his pen and the fire settling. But she did not find the silence uncomfortable, and that surprised her enough that she held the thought at arm's length and did not examine it closely. That was the morning she became aware of him. She recognized the awareness precisely because she had been careful in the preceding 6 years to allow nothing of the kind. If you have been following Andrew's story from that first morning in the library, you may already feel the shape of what is coming. Stay with her. The rest is worth hearing. The 2nd day before the ball. Gale came to the east corridor at 3:30 in the afternoon. Andrew was returning from the linen room, where she had been on an errand for Frederica, and he fell into step beside her with the smooth ease of a man who has rehearsed the approach. He spoke quietly, just beneath the range of the corridor's carrying echo, and what he said amounted to this. He had been speaking with Lady Cecily. He had found the Dowager a most sympathetic listener. He believed that certain matters left unaddressed might create considerable difficulty for Andrew's current position, and for several reputations in addition to her own. Andrew stopped walking. The corridor was stone-floored and cold, and from the alcove at its far end came the sound of someone moving china at a sideboard. "You are threatening His Grace," she said. "I am offering an arrangement," Gale said. "The same one I offered you 6 years ago, which you chose not to accept then. A woman in your position might make a different calculation now." He meant money. He meant her continued silence about the £40, and in exchange, he would not take to Cecily whatever new story he had constructed about Andrew's time in his household. But the thing he was also saying, underneath the arrangement, was that he had more than Andrew's reputation at his disposal. He had Edmund's. She did not know yet what that meant, but she had seen men with Gale's particular quality of confidence, and she knew it was not constructed from nothing. She said, "I will give you my answer by tomorrow morning." She gave him nothing else. She found Mrs. Dora Hartley in the housekeeper's room an hour later. Hartley was 70, if she was a day, a small, solid woman with white hair wound close to her head and hands that had spent half a century managing the business of a great house. She had worked at Harrowfield for 40 years. She knew as such, women always know, a very great deal more than she was ever asked about. "Mrs. Hartley," Andrew said. She closed the housekeeper's door behind her, which was either rude or necessary, and she sat in the chair Hartley indicated, and said what she knew about Thomas Gale, and about the £40, and about the 6 years between Hertfordshire and this corridor. She said it plainly without seeking sympathy, because she had not come for sympathy. Hartley listened, without interrupting. When Andrew had finished, the housekeeper was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He made a similar approach last autumn, to a housemaid here. I handled it then. I did not know there was a governess in Hertfordshire." She paused. "What will you do?" "I will not accept his arrangement," Andrew said. Hartley looked at her with the weighing attention of a woman who has seen many things and formed reliable opinions about most of them. "No," she said.
"I did not think you would."
Andrew did not know that Edmund had been standing in the corridor outside the housekeeper's door for 3 minutes, having arrived with a question about the ball's arrangements and found the door closed and the voice inside it, one he recognized from 2 library mornings. She did not know that he had heard enough to understand what was being said, or that he had stood entirely still in the corridor for the duration, or that his hand had settled against the doorframe, without his being aware of it. She did not know any of this. She found out later what it had cost him to walk away without speaking. What had cost him even more, over a longer period, was Eleanor. He had married Eleanor Ashford, born Cartwright, at 24, when she was 22, and the marriage had been a reasonably happy one by the standards available to 2 people in their circumstances, which is not quite the same thing as happy. Eleanor had been a woman of considerable intelligence and very little social ease, and the combination had made her progressively more isolated, across 7 years at Harrowfield, until the isolation became a quality she carried in her body rather than just her circumstances. He had not known what to do with that. He had known how to manage the estate, how to conduct himself in the House of Lords, how to speak to servants and tenants and solicitors, and he had not known how to sit with a woman who was drowning in a room that everyone else in the house found comfortable. She had died in the spring, 7 years ago, in a manner that the attending physician had, with considerable mercy, recorded as fever. Edmund had sealed that record with a payment that did not appear in any household account, and a silence that did not cost him anything for the first 2 years, because the grief was large enough to fill the space that the secret occupied. By the 3rd year, the grief had changed shape, become something less like a wound, and more like a specific knowledge, the knowledge that he had failed to see what was in front of him until it was past the point of reaching. He kept Eleanor's miniature on the library mantel, turned to face the wall, because looking at it directly was a thing he had not yet been able to manage. He had told no one, not Cecily, who would have understood only the social cost. Not his solicitor, not the physician who had written the record. The secret was his, and he carried it the way one carries a small stone in a closed hand, aware of it at all times, never able to put it down. He understood from what he had heard in the corridor that Thomas Gale had learned what that stone was. He understood that Gale was using Andrew as leverage to keep a different secret of his own, and that Andrew had been carrying the weight of Gale's secret for 6 years, at a cost she had absorbed entirely into herself, without complaint. He stood in the library that evening, after the dinner at which Cecily had placed Philippa Vance at his right hand, and Andrew at the farthest end of the table, and he looked at the miniature facing the wall, and felt something shift in the architecture of his chest. Something that had been sealed move slightly and permit a small quantity of air. The dinner had been an instruction. Cecily had managed it the way she managed most things, through arrangement and implication rather than declaration, and the instruction it contained was plain. Here is the correct choice. Seated here at your right hand, and here is the problem removed to the far end of the table where problems belong. He had watched Andrew across 30 feet of linen and silver and candlelight, and she had eaten what was placed before her, and spoken pleasantly with the man to her left, and not once looked toward the head of the table where he sat, and he had found he could not look away from that. Cecily, he understood, had spoken with Gale. He had seen them in the blue drawing room before dinner, 20 minutes of low, precise conversation, and Cecily's face had held the expression it wore when she believed she was about to solve something. She had come to him afterward with a particular brightness in her manner that he recognized as the leading edge of something she intended to press home, and she had said, in the smooth, practical way she said things of this kind, that the governess with the damaged reference was a social liability, that Frederica Colston had been careless to bring her to Harrowfield, and that he might wish to consider whether a woman of Philippa Vance's connections and character might not be a more suitable long-term presence in the house. He had said nothing. He had looked at her, and she had read something in his face and moved on to other subjects, and the brightness in her manner had dimmed by one precise degree. Andrew, for her part, had retired to her room after dinner, and sat at the writing table for a long time without lighting a candle, because light would have required a decision about what she was going to write, and she was not yet certain she had made it. The window was dark except for the snow, which had begun again in earnest, fine and consistent, lying on the window ledge in a narrow white line. She thought about the parish children in Hertfordshire, who were the reason she had kept the first silence. She thought about Edmund, who had kept a silence of his own for a year longer than she had kept hers, and who had kept it, she now suspected, not for social advantage, but because there had been someone he was trying to protect, even after that person was beyond protecting. She thought about the way he had said sit down in the library, which she had at first taken for dismissal, and now understood had been the opposite of dismissal. She lit the candle. She found paper. She wrote in her plain, even hand, the hand she had trained into governessing correctness in the years when she had still expected to spend her life as a governess. And what she wrote was the truth. She named the £40. She named the 7 entries. She named the 5 years between her dismissal and the present at which she had continued to say nothing, and she named the year before that in which she had found the accounts, so that the record was complete. She wrote that she did not ask Edmund to act on what she was giving him, only that she wished him to know it, and that if Gale had made him aware of Eleanor, he should know that she had not sought that knowledge and would take it to her own grave without his instruction. She folded the letter and sealed it, and wrote his name on the outside in the correct formal address, and then she sat for a moment with it in her hands, understanding that sending it meant she had made the only choice available to her, and that the choice would either end the threat or end her position at Harrowfield, and that she was not, in the end, very afraid of either outcome, because she had stopped being afraid of outcomes 6 years ago on a November morning in Hertfordshire, and had simply not found occasion to notice it until now. She gave the letter to Mrs. Hartley at 7 in the morning, before the ball's guests had come down. Hartley held it for a moment and looked at the address, and then looked at Andrew, and she said only, "I will see that he has it. Before 10. The ball began at 8 in the evening. There were, as there had been estimated, approximately 60 guests assembled in the Harrowfield ballroom by 9, a room that Edmund's grandmother had had redecorated in ivory and gold, with pier glasses along the east wall that multiplied the candlelight, until the room appeared to contain twice its actual number of people. A string quartet played at the far end. The floor was warm with bodies and fire, and the air carried beeswax and the faint, expensive scent of hothouse flowers arranged in tall vases at the room's corners. Andrew wore the white muslin again, because it was the best gown she had, and she stood near the wall with Frederica, and watched the room and waited. She did not know whether Edmund had read her letter. She did not know whether it had changed anything, or whether the change she had felt possible was something she had manufactured from hope and firelight and 2 mornings in a library. She knew only that Gale was across the room in conversation with a pair of gentlemen she did not recognize, and that his ease of manner had increased since the afternoon in the corridor, which meant he believed the balance had shifted in his favor. Cecily entered at 9 on the quarter hour, with Philippa on her arm, and the room acknowledged them with the slight collective adjustment of posture that a room makes around a person of her rank and certainty. She found Edmund near the doorway to the terrace and spoke to him for several minutes, and Andrew watched their faces across the room and could read nothing certain in either of them. Cecily's fan moved at a measured height. Philippa stood at her left, still and lovely in the rose silk, her eyes moving around the room with the pleasant proprietary interest of a woman who expects to like what she is looking at. Gale crossed the room toward Andrew at 9:15. He moved without haste, the way a man moves when he believes the ground is solid under his feet, and he reached her and greeted Frederica by name with great warmth, and said something pleasant about the ball and the snow. And then, when Frederica's attention was briefly turned, he said, "Do you have an answer for me?" She said, "I do." She said it without looking at him, because she was looking at Edmund, who had separated from Cecily, and was crossing the room, and she understood in the moment she watched him cross it that he had read the letter and had made a calculation of his own, and that the calculation had produced this: 36 people between him and the center of the room. His face entirely composed, entirely still, and moving through the crowd with the particular economy of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is doing it. He stopped in the center of the floor, at a point equidistant from the quartet and the pier glasses, and the room slowed around him the way rooms do around a person of his rank when that person does something unexpected. 2 couples who had been moving toward the dance floor paused. The man speaking to the woman near the pillar stopped speaking. The quartet played on for a bar, and then fell quiet, 1 instrument at a time, until there was nothing in the room but the fire, and 60 peoples held attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edmund said, and his voice was level and even and carried without effort to every corner of the room, "I find I have 2 things to say before this evening continues, and I will be brief, as I dislike speeches." Cecily, from near the door, went entirely still. Her fan stopped moving. That stillness cost her something, and the people nearest to her could see it. He said, 7 years ago, my wife Eleanor died at Harrowfield. The record name's fever. Fever was not the cause of her death. Eleanor died as a consequence of a despair so long in its building that I did not see it until it was complete, and she was buried in consecrated ground through the mercy of the physician who attended her, and the silence of a man I paid to keep it. I have kept that silence 7 years. I break it tonight because it is mine to break, and because there is a man in this room who has used it as a weapon, and I prefer to disarm him myself. No one spoke. The snow was visible through the tall windows at the far end of the room, falling straight and fine in the dark outside the glass. "The second matter," Edmund said. "Miss Andrew Fraser came to Harrowfield 4 days ago as a companion to her cousin. bearing a reputation that Reverend Thomas Gale of Hertfordshire spent 6 years constructing for her. The foundation of that reputation is this. Miss Fraser discovered 6 years ago that Gale had removed £40 from his parish poor relief account across 7 false entries in his household ledger. She said nothing. She chose not to expose him for the sake of the parish school he operated, which 12 children depended upon. He dismissed her the following week and provided the character reference that has closed every household in this county. To her since he paused. Mrs. Hartley. From near the wall, Hartley moved forward 2 steps. She was small and entirely composed, and she said, in a voice that required no amplification, "I witnessed the Reverend's approach to Miss Fraser in the East Corridor 2 days ago. He offered money for continued silence. She refused it." She stopped. That was all she required. Gale had not moved. He stood among the gentlemen he had been speaking with, and his face had undergone one of its small revisions, except this one did not end in a smile. He had spent 6 years maintaining a careful architecture of implication and controlled information, and he understood, in this moment, that the architecture had no foundation beneath it now, and was coming down with the particular speed of things that were never as solid as they appeared. One of the gentlemen near him stepped back. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but in a room of 60 people, all of whom were watching, it was sufficient. Cecily, at the door, drew herself to her full height. The calculation behind her eyes was brief, and if Andrew was reading her correctly across 30 feet of candlelight, it landed on something that was not quite recognition, but was adjacent to it. She looked from Edmund to Andrew to the empty space where her plan for the evening had been, and then she looked at her fan, which she closed with a precise click that the nearest guests could hear, and she said nothing. There was a dignity in it of a kind. She was wrong, but she was not small. Philippa Vance, to her credit, looked at Edmund for a long, quiet moment. And then she looked at Andrew, and then she looked away to the middle distance with an expression of someone making a private, accurate assessment, and choosing not to speak it aloud. She remained exactly where she was, which was the graceful choice, and Andrew found she could not think badly of her. For it, Edmund crossed the remainder of the floor. The crowd arranged itself without being asked to, the way crowds do when they understand that the space at the center is now claimed, and he stopped 3 feet from Andrew, and Frederica beside her made a small sound that might have been a suppressed exclamation and then went very quiet. "Miss Fraser," Edmund said, and his voice had lost its carrying quality and become only large enough for the 2 of them, though in the silence of the room it carried farther than he perhaps intended. "Your Grace," she said. He said, "I have been in possession of your letter since 10 this morning. I have spent the intervening hours considering what manner of man would read it and do nothing." She waited. "I found I could not be that man," he said. It was as a declaration, not long. It was not florid. It contained no metaphor and very little ornamentation. She had spent 6 years inside a story about herself that Gale had authored, a story in which she was the disgraced governess who had invented a false accusation against a respectable clergyman, and in the 30 seconds it had taken Edmund to speak 2 paragraphs in a well-lit room. That story had been set aside in front of 60 people, and a different one, the true one, had been placed where it stood. She felt the weight of the false story leaving her body, the way one feels a held breath release. Not dramatically, not all at once, but as a slow returning of some capacity she had not noticed she had lost. She said, "You have broken your own silence to do this." "Yes," he said, "that cost you something." "Yes," he said again, and for the first time since she had known him, a single line appeared at the corner of his mouth that was almost, but not precisely, a smile. Though considerably less than I had imagined it would. The musicians, with the professional sensitivity of people who make their living reading rooms, began again quietly at the far end, something measured and low, and the crowd resumed the gentle motion of a gathering that has witnessed something it will speak of for several seasons, and is now making the social accommodation of pretending to have moved on. Gale departed Harrowfield that evening before 11. Andrew did not see him go. She was told of it afterward by Hartley, who reported it in the plain tone of someone noting weather. The library was quiet by midnight. Most of the guests had retired to the rooms prepared for them, or had made their carriages home through the snow, and the great house had settled into its night sounds, the tick of cooling stone, the shift of settling wood, the distant closing of a door at the end of a corridor. Edmund had lit only the 2 candles on the mantelpiece, and the fire had burned down to a deep, comfortable bed of coals that threw more warmth and light across the near wall of books. The snow outside the window was still falling, slower now, accumulating on the stone sill in a clean, unbroken line. Andrew stood at the writing table with her back to the room, though she was not looking at the papers on it. She was listening to the fire and to the quality of the silence, which was different from the silence of the past 6 years. Less like an absence and more like an arrival, Edmund came to stand beside the mantelpiece. He did not speak immediately. That was a quality she had observed in him, and it stopped misreading as coldness 3 days ago, in this same room, the capacity to occupy a silence without filling it unnecessarily. His eyes were on Eleanor's miniature, which had stood face to the wall for 7 years on that shelf, and after a moment he reached out and turned it, slowly so that it faced the room. It was a small ivory oval in a plain gold frame, and the woman in it had dark eyes and a grave, considered expression, the kind of face that held its own counsel. He looked at it for a long moment, and Andrew looked with him, and the fire shifted once in the grate and went on burning. "She would have found you interesting," he said. "Eleanor. She had a considerable regard for people who choose the difficult right thing over the easy manageable thing." Andrew did not answer immediately. She was thinking of a woman she had never met, who had died in this house in the spring 7 years ago, and who had been carried in a sealed silence by the man standing 3 feet from her, and she thought about what it had cost him to stand in the ballroom and open that silence like a window in a room that had been closed too long. She said, "I am glad she had someone who thought her worth protecting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I failed to protect her. What I did was conceal the evidence of my failure." He said it without self-exoneration, as a fact. "Those are not the same thing." "No," Andrew said. "They are not, all the same." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. He looked at her across the candlelight and the dying fire, and she looked back, and the awareness she had been carrying carefully at arm's length since the first morning in this room moved, without warning, to the center of her chest and settled there as though it had always meant to. "Andrew," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He spoke it with the quality of a man handling something he has been wanting to handle for some time, and is only now permitting himself, and the sound of it in the quiet room was the most specific thing she had heard in 6 years. She could not have explained afterward precisely what either of them said in the next quarter hour, because the quality of those minutes was not in the words but in their arrangement, in the way a sentence could be left unfinished and understood completely. In the way the fire's warmth, and the snow's quiet, and the room's long memory of being a room she had found before he did, all combined into something she had not expected to be standing inside. She had not expected, at 27 having carried a 6-year silence across 3 counties and into a stranger's house, to find herself standing in a library at midnight, with the cold outside and the warmth inside, and a man who had spent 7 years keeping a secret, not unlike her own, and who had broken his in a room full of witnesses in order to break hers as well. There is a kind of recognition that is not sudden, even when it arrives in a single moment, is built in installments, in library mornings and corridor silences, and the particular quality of a man's attention crossing a room, and by the time it announces itself, it has been present for some time, waiting for the moment when both people in the room are finally able to stop pretending they have not already understood. She had not thought she would be chosen. She had spent 6 years learning not to expect it. Andrew Fraser stood in the library at Harrowfield, with snow at the window and fire at the grate and Eleanor's miniature, watching the room at last from its place on the mantel, and Edmund spoke her name as though he had been keeping it as carefully as he had kept everything else, and she realized with a precision that was entirely new that the weight she had carried for 6 years was not gone so much as it had been lifted from her and set down elsewhere. Somewhere outside this room, outside this house, somewhere in the cold where neither of them was required to go back and retrieve it. If you have stayed this far with Andrew, you already know what she said when he asked. Leave a word in the comments if you are so moved, and tell me what moment first made you certain of him. Then stay a little longer. In the weeks that followed, the snow continued, and the house grew quieter in the way great houses do, when the season empties them of their guests and returns them to themselves. Frederica Colston went home to her own establishment, with every appearance of satisfaction and a great deal more knowledge than she had arrived with. Cecily departed for her dower house at the New Year, with a composure that Andrew, watching her carriage roll down the drive, found she could genuinely respect. Cecily had been wrong. She had been wrong with consistency and considerable craft, and she had recognized her error in a single precise moment in a ballroom, and she had not made it worse by arguing with what she had seen. That was not nothing. Gale did not return to his parish. The bishop's inquiry was opened in January, and the matter of £40 was placed before it in plain terms, with records that Hartley had quietly and competently assembled across several days before the ball. Because Hartley was a woman who believed in thorough preparation and had seen enough of life to know that the moment for preparation is always earlier than one thinks. Edmund and Andrew were married in the chapel at Harrowfield on the first clear day of February, with Hartley and 2 of the older housemaids as witnesses and a Harrowfield vicar, a pleasant young man who had not previously been asked to perform a ceremony on 24 hours' notice, and managed it with good grace. There were no guests beyond the witnesses, and Frederica, who wept at appropriate moments and then rallied completely for the wedding breakfast. That evening they sat in the library after dinner, and the fire was exactly as it had been on the night of the ball, deep and warm and red at its center. And the snow was at the window again, the fine straight snow that had been falling on and off since December, lying in its clean white line on the stone sill. Andrew had a book open in her lap that she was not reading, and Edmund was at the writing table not working on his papers, and the room held them both in the particular quiet that a room holds when the people inside it have decided without ceremony that this is where they will be. She looked at Eleanor's miniature on the mantel, turned to face the room. Edmund looked up from his papers and found her looking at it, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and outside the window the snow went on falling, patient and exact, covering the park of Harrowfield, in a white so clean it held the last light long after the sky had gone dark. She was home.